Context for Kids, and we're going to talk about adoption in the ancient world this week. It's going to get slightly PG, or depending on your parents' point of view, PG-13, because we're going to very briefly mention abortion in ancient Rome, which was illegal, and infanticide, which sadly was legal. So make sure your parents are really cool with me talking about these subjects with you. It'll only be brief, and so go ask them and I'll wait. Okay, so welcome back, and like I already said, I'm Miss Tyler. This is Context for Kids, and this is lesson number 9 or 10. I just can't remember, but this is the long-promised favorite subject of mine, adoption in the ancient world. And why do I love adoption? Well, some of my favorite people are adopted, not the least of which are my two sons, Matthew and Andrew, who we adopted at birth. But also, who else in the Bible is adopted? A lot of people. And so we're going to talk about that. As a matter of fact, some of the most prominent people, because they're not characters like characters in a book, they were real people. So some of the most beloved and important individuals that are whose stories are recorded in the Bible, how about that, were adopted. So we're going to have fun talking about that. So why are we talking about it this week when we're in the new gospel? Because of Jesus, son of Joseph, who we are going to see in the scriptures, or Yeshua ben Yosef would have been his Hebrew name. So here we go. So first we're going to talk about what it says in Matthew, language that may not even, you're going to go, what the heck does that have to do with adoption? Well, I'm going to share it with you. You see, if you know about adoption in the ancient world, this kind of language just jumps out at you. As a matter of fact, I'm going to teach you how a lot of Paul's language is going to jump out at you too. So this is going to be a very exciting lesson that is going to have ramifications about how you understand everything just about in the New Testament, like honor and shame. Once you know honor and shame, you're going, whoa, there, yeah, it's all over the place. So is adoption. So anyway, here we go. Now we know that Joseph is not the father of Yeshua, Jesus, obviously. Mary, in her own words in Luke, says, but I've never been with a man, when the angel Gabriel told her that she was going to have a son. And no problem, God can do anything, right? So here we go. And Joseph found out she was pregnant. Now, we found out a couple weeks ago that they were betrothed, but they'd never been secluded together. And you know what that means, because we've talked about that before, so we won't go over it again. So what does he do? All of a sudden his fiancée is pregnant, and he knows he's not the dad. Well, an angel came to him and said, do not be afraid to take her, because the child conceived in her is from the Ruach HaKodesh, or the Holy Spirit is the more common way of putting that. She will give birth to a son. She will give birth to a son, not his son. And here's the important bit. And you shall call his name Yeshua, for he will save his people from their sins. And of course, we've talked about how the name Yeshua, the Hebrew name, became Jesus, step by step, with transliterations and translations. And Yeshua is a word that means that God will save. Adonai will save. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh will save. All those. All right? But it says, you shall call his name Yeshua. It didn't say Mary's going to call his name Yeshua. It said Joseph was going to call his name Yeshua. And that is very important. Okay. Da-da-da-da-da. When Joseph woke from his sleep, he did as the angel of Adonai commanded and took Mary as his wife. But he did not know her intimately until she had given birth to a son. And here we have it again. And he, Joseph, called his name Yeshua. And you go, big whoop. I'm going to show you big whoop right here. Okay, so here we go. I got to read this in tiny little writing. Okay, this is from Romans chapter 8, verses 14 through 17. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are the sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery. That's going to be important too. To fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit Himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs. That's also important. So I want you to remember some of these words. We're going to go through them again. Heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with Him in order that we may also be glorified with Him. Now remember, Christ was is our form of Christos. It means anointed one. It's the same thing that Mashiach, Messiah, means in Hebrew. As a matter of fact, if we go back to the Septuagint, which we've talked about, the Greek translation of the Bible, we'll see that those 70 or 72 rabbis, depending on which account you want to believe, that's the word they used sometimes for anointed one, Mashiach. They used Christos. It's just the word in Hebrew because they didn't have a word for, they didn't have the same words for things because they're two different languages. Duh, right? Okay. So, I need you to remember these words. Let's see. Slavery. Adoption as sons. Let's see. Heirs. Heirs is important. Do you know what an heir is? An heir is somebody who's going to receive an inheritance. That is so important. I'm so excited. I love this topic. I love it so much. I wrote a whole chapter about it in my book, King, Kingdom, Citizen, which is more for like high schoolers. But it talks about our rights as citizens in the kingdom of God and how grafted-in Gentiles are not second-class citizens. That in Messiah we are all one. But, okay, rabbit trail. All right, I'm just excited about adoption. Okay, adoption in the Bible. Got a lot of people in the Bible who were adopted. According to Josephus, Lot was adopted. That's Abraham's nephew. Eliezer of Damascus. Abraham planned to adopt him as an heir. There's that word again, heir. And we've got Jacob. Jacob, the grandson of Abraham and the son of Isaac. Who adopted Jacob? Well, we'll get to that. Moses. Everybody knows Moses was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, probably Pharaoh himself. Doesn't really say, but we know he was adopted into the royal family. Esther. If you've ever celebrated Purim, then you know Esther's family died, and her uncle Mordecai adopted her as a child. Cyrus, we talked about Cyrus a few weeks ago. Cyrus was left out for the dogs to eat. Awful. Because his grandfather had received a prophecy that he was going to destroy his kingdom. Well, he did. But Cyrus was adopted by... Well, we'll talk about that. I'm getting ahead of myself. And of course, the most famous adopted person ever, Yeshua, or Jesus. And the most important. Not just the most famous, but also the most important. Now, let's look at Lot. According to Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian, Lot was adopted by Abraham as a son, but then, of course, Lot and Abraham separated. And so Lot could no longer be Abraham's heir, because Abraham didn't have a son, so he needed somebody to bury him, to take care of Sarah, and to take over the household so that the hired men and everything wouldn't, all his hired people and his servants and everything, that they wouldn't be in danger. All right. Eliezer of Damascus was Abraham's planned adoptive heir before Ishmael was born. Okay? But God said, no, you're not going to do, he's not your heir. You're not going to have to adopt him. I'm going to give you a son from your own body. All right, so Eliezer of Damascus was going to be adopted as an heir, but he wasn't because God said no. Moses was adopted into Pharaoh's royal family. Now, I'm going to tell you something really, really cool, and I didn't put the chapter, but it's Deuteronomy 18, I'm sorry, when Moses says that God will send a prophet like me. And so one of the really interesting things, and this would be something, maybe we'll do a series on it someday, but it'd be way in the future. One of the really cool things to do is to go through the story of Moses and find parallels with Yeshua, Jesus. Okay? And one of them was that, of course, Yeshua is that prophet like Moses that Moses prophesied of way back in Deuteronomy. He prophesied the coming Messiah. Yeshua was a prophet like Moses, and so their lives are going to be paralleled. Moses was adopted into a royal family. So was Yeshua. Just one of the, bazillion, not that many, ways that Yeshua was like Moses. Of course, we don't know everything about Yeshua, and we don't know everything about Moses, so there are probably a lot more parallels we just don't know about. I guess the Bible recorded enough of them. Esther was adopted, of the book of Esther, was adopted by her uncle Mordecai when her family died. We already talked about that. And I talked about King Cyrus was adopted by a shepherd's family when his grandfather tried to have him killed. We talked about that one in Messiah's origin story, Honor and Shame. And so that's, if you want to go back and see that, that was really cool. Okay, so adoption in the Bible, because Cyrus's adoption wasn't in the Bible. Just like Moses, Yeshua was adopted into the royal line of Judah. His mother was descended from Nathan, David's son, yes, but a non-royal son. He wasn't a son he was a prince, but his sons weren't princes. His sons were just kind of nobility and kind of diluted as it went down. Still an honorable family line, and I'm sure he was named after Nathan the prophet. But he wasn't royal. And we talk about this just about every week. How do we know that the Luke 3 genealogy is Mary's? Well, Luke 1 through 3, and maybe even into 4, it's all Mary's experiences. If you read it, everything's about Mary. Whereas in Matthew 1 and 2, everything is from Joseph's point of view. So the Matthew 1 genealogy, which is the only genealogy the Jews would have recognized, was Joseph's. And that's why people going down the street, they would say, son of David, because they all identified him as the son of Joseph, who was of the royal line going through all the kings. And we'll talk about that later. They wouldn't care who his mother was. Nobody cared who anyone's mother was. And even today, with the royal families all over the world, unless there are no sons, it goes through the males. It just does. It just does. Oh, and sometimes when there are only daughters, it goes through an uncle. It just depends. All right, so, Okay, his mother Mary was descended from a non-royal son of David, Nathan, and a daughter of the priestly line of Aaron. And as we talked about last week, the fact that it was Mary's cousin Elizabeth who was priestly was very, very important to establishing Mary's innocence. Very important. It had to be Mary's cousin and not Joseph's. Well, no, it could, never mind, it could have been if it was the other way around. Never mind. You know I get flustered all the time. Oh, I write better than I teach, don't I? Alright, so in the ancient Near East, so here we're getting to the good stuff. Adoption was a very common way to get an heir if you didn't have one. Now, what was an heir? We talked about the definition of an heir. An heir is somebody who's going to inherit everything you have. Oh, I didn't put Jacob in with oh, look at that, I forgot. Okay, or sometimes if you wanted a different heir, okay? Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, those guys, they A lot of them had sons. I think I just jumped ahead. Sometimes someone would have a son, but they weren't suitable to run the family, whatever, and so they would adopt somebody else. That's what they would do in like the Roman Empire. Now, Lot, Eliezer, and Jacob were all adopted by men who had no sons at the time of the adoption, and like I said, I forgot to mention Jacob. He's actually one of the more important people on the list. Now, he went to the city of Haran to get himself a bride, and he showed up without a bride price. We don't know how that happened. It's kind of one of those weird stories in the scripture. I'm sure Laban was very disappointed. But at the time, we see Laban's daughter out in the fields with the sheep. And that wasn't done in those days unless there were no sons. We see the same thing with Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, where Jethro had 7 daughters and no sons, and so the daughters were out with the sheep. But it wasn't really the safest situation out there, and you really didn't want your women out there with no one to guard their honor or to protect them from accusation. So Rachel was out attending the flocks when Jacob came across her. Now, after Jacob was there, Jacob tended the flocks, Rachel didn't anymore. And then sometime within the next 20 years, all of a sudden, Laban has sons. Okay? So, well, it's a very complicated story. It's in my next book that I've got coming out. It's too complicated for here. I'll be talking about it forever. But if you look at the laws of the ancient world, it's kind of obvious that Laban adopted Jacob, and then Laban had to do something to get Jacob out of inheriting with his sons. And so he played the really nasty trick of getting Jacob to take 2 wives, which invalidated his inheritance. Like I said, it's in my next book. Okay. Which is not for kids. It's not. All right. Adoption in the world outside of Israel. Augustus Caesar was adopted by Julius, his uncle. Tiberius was adopted by Augustus Caesar, his uncle. Caligula was adopted by Tiberius. Claudius was after him, but he was an uncle. And then Nero was adopted as... See, it's not that these people didn't have children. It's that they chose who they wanted to be the next emperor. So they were adopting heirs. So adoption in the ancient world wasn't second-class citizenship. It wasn't... and if you're an adoptive family, you understand. You understand. My sons are my sons, and even if somehow the unthinkable were to happen, and I would have a baby at my age, which, no. See, I wouldn't have any time to study anymore, and I wouldn't be doing this anymore, so unless you hate my teaching, don't pray for Miss Tyler to have a baby. I'm too old. I'm going to be 48 next month. Just no. I've earned a break. Anyway, but if I was to have a baby, Matthew would still be my firstborn, Andrew would still be my secondborn, and whoever it would be my thirdborn. And any adoptive family will tell you that. That's just the way it goes. All right. Let's talk about the Law of Hammurabi, which was written at the time of Abraham. Now, Abraham lived like in the 19th century BCE. So he lived as far away, time-wise, from Yeshua, Jesus, as we do. Okay, and just a little bit more. So that was a long time ago. That was like 4,000 years ago. Well, no, not quite. 3,900 years ago. My math isn't great today. So let's read law number 185 of the Code of Hammurabi. And I don't have my book here, but the book that I get all my laws out of was written by Martha T. Roth, and it was like law collections in ancient Mesopotamia and that kind of stuff. All right, Law 185, and this is like, oh, I didn't get this one out of this. This one's Reuven Yaron's translation. I can't remember where that came out of, but Martha T. Roth's book is really good if you want to know the law codes of the ancient world. Not to be read without parental guidance, though, however. Dang. All right. So, because some of those people back then made some messed up laws. That's in my book too. Jeez. All right. If a man, an infant, out of his amniotic fluid for sonship has taken and has brought him up, that adopted child shall not be reclaimed. I know, right? Can you speak it in English? Even though it is in English, it's not in English, it's in scholar speak. Okay, what's that saying? If a man took a child directly from birth, that's what out of the amniotic fluid means. Because the amniotic fluid is the fluid inside the mom that keeps the baby from crashing into the walls and stuff. Okay, so if a man takes a baby directly from birth and has brought him up, that adopted child shall not be reclaimed. What does that mean? If a man takes the baby immediately from birth, names him, raises him, it's as though he is the biological father, period. The child doesn't belong to anybody else. Nobody can come around and say, "Excuse me, I want my baby back." No. Doesn't work. It was the parenting that determined who the father was. Not anything else. Not who the biological father was, not through anything. It was the raising of the child who determined who the father is. And that's going to be really important too. I want you to keep that in mind for Paul's writings. All right, so now this is interesting. This actually ties into this. Early Christians had a wonderful reputation in the Roman Empire in some ways. And one of the ways they had an excellent reputation is, now this is a good thing, abortion was illegal in the Roman Empire. It was absolutely distasteful. They thought it was horrible and disgusting. And of course, abortion is the killing of a baby before it's born. And it is legal in the United States and I think most other Western nations. And it's really sad and it's really horrible. Now, you're saying, yay, ancient Rome! Yeah, they didn't have many things going for them, but this is one of the things where I give them 2 thumbs up. There was a flip side of the coin, however. It was perfectly legal to abandon your newborn babies on hillsides. Why? Well, this is where polytheism comes in. This is where not having the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Yeshua, Jesus, comes in. You see, they had all these ideas, all these stories in their heads, like Cyrus, like Romulus and Remus, and just different legends of exceptional babies who were left out to die, who got rescued by the will of the gods. And so these people are thinking, if this child deserves to live, the gods will save them. And I know you're going like, oh, great googly movie, that's so messed up. Well, it is messed up. But that's, you know, people become like the gods they worship. You know, they believed in fate. They didn't look at personal choice as being the determining factor in somebody's integrity. They didn't think about integrity, actually. They thought about honor, about reputation. And life was cheap in those days. They figured if the baby deserved to live, the baby would get rescued. Babies like Moses, babies like Cyrus. Okay? That was the way they thought in the ancient world. Now that wasn't why Moses' mother, of course, put him in the ark and sent him down the river. Not the same thing at all. She had faith in God and her son was going to die if she didn't do it. So, anyway, early Christians would go out and they would rescue these babies when they would find them. And this was a time of terrible poverty. People who hardly had anything and they had to trust in God to provide for them. Now the other people who would rescue these babies were slavers. I told you to remember that Romans 8 verse about slavery, didn't I? Slavery as opposed to adoption, because that meant something in the ancient Roman Empire. So early Christians adopted abandoned infants as sons, as opposed to allowing the slavers to have them. But they became full sons. And they did this because they were adopted as sons. I'm talking about the early Gentile believers, not the early Jewish believers. So this is different. These are the Christians who had formerly been pagans. All right? They were doing this because of what had been done for them. All right. So, we talked about, I gave you a verse, and I forgot to go back to it. She will give birth to a son, and you shall call his name Yeshua. But he did not know her intimately until she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Yeshua. We're going to go back one slide, I think. Yeah. So, when Yeshua was born, and we find this out in Luke, they couldn't find room in an inn. Joseph and Mary were probably alone. Joseph may have even midwifed Yeshua's birth. But regardless of whether there was a midwife or not, that baby was immediately handed to Joseph. And 8 days later, when Yeshua was circumcised, Joseph named him, and he raised them. Well, by the adoption laws of the ancient world, that made Yeshua Joseph's son no matter what. And anyone in the ancient world would have recognized that. That's why he was called Son of David. He was recognized as being Joseph's son. Okay? Oh! I'm wondering if I made a slave about that. Slave. Looking at the word slave. There is this really, really cool thing I've got to tell you. And why it was important that Yeshua was adopted. And not the biological son of Joseph. And this is just... And why it was important that Mary didn't descend from the kingly line of David. Now, I believe it's in Jeremiah 22, and of course I didn't write it down, but I did look it up yesterday. There is a curse that was placed by the prophet Jeremiah from God on the last king of Israel, Jeconiah. And it said that no descendant of Jeconiah would ever sit on the throne of David. And I'll tell you something, this is a prophecy that has bothered everyone for thousands of, bothered the Jewish people and the rabbis and the great sages and scholars for thousands of years, and they've come up with some outs on it, but really the solution is beautiful, very, very simple. Because adoption was final and absolute, and because Yeshua became son of Joseph, son of David. And we even see that in... No, we're not going to go back there. Okay? I'm getting off on a tangent again. Because adoption was final, because Yeshua was absolutely Joseph's heir. And Joseph was absolutely King Jeconiah's living heir. Yeshua could be the heir to the kingdom because his adoption made him 100% the son of Joseph, the son of Jeconiah through adoption. He was also a physical descendant of David through Mary, but not Solomon. See, he wasn't a physical descendant of Solomon. He was a physical descendant of David, but he was also from the kingly line. I mean, how do you get someone who's a descendant but not a descendant? I can tell you that. I have descendants. They aren't biologically related to me or my husband. Their names are Matthew and Andrew. And yet if you were to look at their birth certificates, it says Matthew and Andrew Rosenquist, father Mark Rosenquist, mother Tyler Rosenquist. That's what it says on their birth certificate. It doesn't say their birth mother's name. It doesn't say their birth father's name. It says there are descendants. That's the way around the curse of Jeconiah. Adoption. Yeshua was adopted. He is an heir the way we are heirs, through adoption. Yeshua is a picture for what we become in God. And we'll come across that again when we get back into Romans 8. All right, so I told you about early Christians adopting abandoned infants as sons as opposed to slave, and we talked about why that was important, because the slavers were grabbing up those babies. Now let's talk about baptism. Talk about the phrase born again. Now in Jewish thought, before Yeshua was even born, to be born again was to be a Gentile and then to become a believer, to give up the pagan ways, to undergo baptism. You became born again. You were a new creation. Boy, this is all that stuff that Paul talks about. Well, he didn't make it up. That already existed. People would become grafted into God's family, adopted into God's family. Okay? Now, when Yeshua was baptized, and we will talk about this more when we get to it, so we're not going to talk about it much now. But at some point, Joseph died. Okay? And Yeshua began his ministry in his 30th year, so that means he wasn't 30 yet. Okay? He was like 29 years old. Which seems pretty young to me now. All of you guys are going to say, wow, he is an old guy. Some of y'all. And I'm going, oh, man. Let's see. Oh my gosh, I could be his mother. Oh, that's painful. Yeah, I could. Wow, it wouldn't even be a stretch. Okay, I'm in pain now. I'm going to have to go take some painkillers. All right, anyway. We see something interesting happen. This is another parallel between the lives of Moses and Yeshua. You see, Pharaoh died, and Moses was able... Pharaoh died. Pharaoh was Moses' adopted father. And then he was adopted by Jethro, because Jethro had no sons, just like Jacob, except Jethro didn't mess with him. Here's another parallel. At some point, Yeshua's father Joseph died. And we know this because an adoption in the ancient world couldn't be reclaimed. He was Joseph's son until Joseph died. Okay? But when Yeshua was baptized by John the Baptist, even though he was already a Jew, already a believer, any of that stuff, but when he was baptized, that was considered being born again. Baptism. Whenever you do that, it's being born again. All right? So he was born again, and what happens immediately? There is a voice from heaven, which in Hebrew is called a bat kol. Okay? Voice from heaven saying, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." Well, what does that sound like? Well, that sounds an awful lot like what Joseph would have done. When Yeshua was circumcised, he would have said, "This is my son, and his name is Yeshua." Okay? And he would have shown everybody around. He would have been proud because a man's firstborn son was very important to him. Well, when Yeshua came out of the water, just like coming out of the amniotic fluid, the fluid that comes out of the mom when a child is born. That's why adoption was baptism was a picture of that. You're coming out of the water, just like a newborn baby comes out of the water of its mother. All right? And immediately there's this voice saying, "This is my son." Just like when Joseph, when Yeshua was born, "This is my son. This is my son." And so our baptism, when we're baptized, and where we're baptized in Yeshua's name, we become the sons of God. And we become born again. All right. Ta-da-da-da-da. So we're going to do that Romans 8 verse again. And now let's see if you understand it a whole lot better. I'll explain as we're going through. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. Does it say second-class sons of God? Does it say only adopted sons of God? Are there any qualifiers? And a qualifier is something that kind of makes something less important or less special. No, it says we are the sons of God. And the adoptive family will tell you that. There's no such thing as sons and not quite sons. There's only sons. and daughters. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons. What did the early Christians do? They adopted abandoned babies as sons instead of allowing the slavers to get them. Isn't that awesome and amazing? Isn't that an awesome piece of context? Do you see why I enjoy studying this stuff? All right. But we received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. Again, only adopted children of God? Second-class children of God? No. Children of God, no qualifiers. There it is. And if children, then heirs. What are heirs? Heirs are the people who are going to inherit. We'll talk about what we inherit sometime in the future. Heirs of God, because he's our Father. Now before all this, only the Jews called him Father. Okay? But anyone who's grafted into the family of Abraham, whether they're Jews or whether they're ingrafted, okay, like you and me probably, or maybe not all of you, but me, okay? Heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ. Because he was also adopted back. Okay? The son shall not be reclaimed, but after Joseph was dead, God could lay claim on him again, which he did at the baptism. This is my son, in whom I am well pleased. Provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. So does that verse, do those verses make a lot more sense now? Do you see how God views adoption? You see how I see adoption? Adoption was God's choice, not only for Moses, not only for Esther, not only for Yeshua, but for us. And so we shouldn't look at it as, well, we're only the adoptive children. Paul says in another portion of Scripture that to be a Jew is of every benefit, because to them belongs the adoption as sons. Adoption as sons is nothing new. It's an ancient Jewish concept. King Solomon was adopted. We've talked about that before. So, I really hope I covered everything that I meant to cover. I love this topic, and I get a little emotional, but y'all are used to that. Oh, my shirt. I've worn this one before. But this is like, and I don't think you can see the bottom of it. This is like my favorite superhero shirt. And this is Captain America saying, I want you to watch your language. I love this shirt. All right. So how about let's do our discipleship lesson really quick, because boy, this video is taking a long time because I love this topic. All right, so something happened this last week, and it was an adult thing. And it was a bad adult thing. And someone did something wrong. Really, really, really wrong. And everybody lashed out at this person because what they did was so awful. Okay? Now, after she did it, and after she saw it was not going good for her, she apologized. However, it was already too late because so much damage had been done. But a lot of people started going, well, she's apologized, so let's forgive her, let's back off and everything. But then, after apologizing, she decided to play the victim because she wasn't happy with how people had been treating her. Well, there's an important lesson in this, boys and girls and boys and pets and parents and everybody. You know what? When we push somebody, when we do something to somebody, we don't get to holler if they push back and push back even harder. You know what? I'll tell you something. I love the people who worked in the civil rights movement back in the 50s and 60s. They were these amazing, amazing people. And one of the things, now what they were doing was righteous and right, okay, because they wanted there to be equal treatment for black people and white people. And I mean, in some places in the United States, you could hang black people. It's just horrible. And not have anything bad happen to you. You could do horrifying things because of racism. Anyway, they wanted equal rights. They weren't being allowed to vote. They weren't being allowed to sit in the same places in restaurants or in theaters or drink out of the same fountains. And I mean, anyone young is going, say what? No! You know, what you talking about, Willis? No. That's just unthinkable. I mean, now if people tried that, even most nasty people would kick and scream and say, whoa, that is just messed up. Because we weren't brought up in that kind of society. But what they told these civil rights workers, these young and old people, these ministers and normal everyday people and politicians and whoever, they're saying, okay, if you go sit in the white section of the restaurant, you're breaking the law. If you sit in the white section of the bus, you are breaking the law. And you have to be prepared to go to jail because that is the consequence. And they did. And they were peaceful. You know, and they weren't going around whining and complaining. They just, when they got out of jail, they went back and did it again. And they broke down the resistance, and how they behaved themselves impressed the nation and really changed the way people looked at civil rights. It was their behavior and their class that changed the way the nation was viewing them. Okay? But that's not what happened with this woman who did something awful. I'm sure your parents know what it is. And if they want to talk to you about it, they can. It's really, yeah, it's not that interesting in and of itself, but it was bad, okay? So, she pushed hard. She pushed so hard that even people who agree with her on a lot of other things said, whoa, that is messed up. And they turned on her, okay? But then she started pretending like she was a victim, and she was saying, well, I'm a comedian. I should have free speech, and I should have... What she wanted was no consequences. And you see, like those civil rights workers were doing the right thing, but they knew there would be consequences for doing the right thing, but they still did the right thing. That was the attitude that if she really thought she was doing the right thing, she would have taken her consequences. And she would have zipped her lip. And she wouldn't have played the victim, because when we push somebody, they're going to push back. And we have to expect it. And we can't cry and holler and shout when they push back, because we provoked them. If we're doing the right thing, then that's the price we pay for doing the right thing, is to get pushed back. Now, I'm not saying to go push people. Not like that, because that's not what Martin Luther King and everybody were. They weren't pushing everyone, they were just standing up for their rights. But whatever you do, if you aren't willing to pay the penalty for it, just don't do it. Because you know going in ahead of time what the consequence is going to be. But if you do something wrong like she did, and she even admitted she did wrong, then you just got to take your lumps. You got to take your consequences. So there's a difference between being persecuted, and that's what happened with Martin Luther King and his followers. They were being persecuted even before they did it, so it was just more persecution. They were being persecuted, and they still took it with class. She wasn't being persecuted. She was facing consequences. And in all the things we do, you know what? We need to be willing to face persecution, but we should not provoke people to take consequences on us when we have done the wrong thing. Anyway, so that's this week, and I love you. I'm praying for you. I pray you have a wonderful week studying the scriptures together as a family. And next week we start Matthew 2. Can you believe it? It's only been like 10 weeks or 11. I don't know. But I'm studying Bethlehem in my handy dandy, totally elite atlas, which I will show you next week. It is awesome. But we're going to be talking about geography. We're going to be talking about the city of Bethlehem. And I learned some really cool things about it. So anyway, love you, praying for you, and I hope you have a wonderful week studying the scripture together as a family and becoming more and more like Yeshua, our perfect example of God in the flesh. Bye-bye now.